In the fall of 2015, a 19-year-old lab associate named Erica Chiang walked into the gleaming headquarters of Theranos in Palo Alto, California, believing she was about to change the world. She had been told she would be part of a revolution in healthcare, working alongside a visionary founder who promised to democratize blood testing with just a single drop from a finger prick. But within weeks of starting her job, Erica began to notice something deeply concerning. Test results weren't matching up, quality control samples were failing. And when she raised her concerns, she was met with something she never expected: silence, deflection, and professional pressure. What Erica didn't know yet was that she had stumbled into one of the most significant corporate scandals in American history, a situation so complex that it would raise serious questions about patient safety, business ethics, and ultimately lead to federal criminal convictions. This is the story of Theranos, and it begins not with science, but with unfulfilled promises. But before we understand how it all fell apart, we need to understand how one 19-year-old college dropout convinced the most powerful people in America to believe in something that didn't exist. Elizabeth Holmes was 19 years old when she dropped out of Stanford University in 2003. She wasn't failing. She wasn't parting away her tuition. She had an idea, one she believed would redefine medicine forever. Holmes had always been focused on invention. As a child, she filled notebooks with sketches of devices and patents. She studied Mandarin. She admired Steve Jobs. And she had a singular vision: to create a machine that could run hundreds of blood tests using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick. No needles, no vials, minimal discomfort. She called her company Theranos, a blend of therapy and diagnosis. And she called her device the Edison, after Thomas Edison, the inventor she admired for his relentless pursuit of innovation. But here's what almost no one knew at the time: the Edison didn't work as claimed. Not the way she presented it, not even close. Holmes was exceptional at presentation. She wore black turtlenecks, emulating Steve Jobs. She spoke in a notably deep voice that projected authority. She communicated in grand, sweeping statements about saving lives, about making healthcare accessible, about transforming an industry that needed innovation. And people believed her. Within a few years, she had raised millions of dollars from some of the most prominent venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. By 2010, Theranos had secured partnerships with major retailers. By 2013, the company was valued at nearly $1 billion. And then something extraordinary happened that would make Elizabeth Holmes untouchable, at least for a while. By 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was worth $4.5 billion on paper, making her the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. She graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. magazine. She was invited to speak at conferences alongside heads of state. President Obama appointed her as a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship. She was everywhere. She was celebrated. Major retailers like Walgreens and Safeway invested hundreds of millions into partnerships with Theranos. Her board of directors read like a who's who of American power: Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, James Mattis, William Perry. These weren't tech entrepreneurs. These were former secretaries of state and defense, towering figures in American politics. And their presence sent a clear message: Theranos was legitimate. Elizabeth Holmes was the real deal. But behind the glossy magazine covers and the soaring valuations, something was fundamentally wrong. What the world didn't know was that the machine at the center of this empire, the Edison, had a devastating secret. The Edison machine, the device that was supposed to revolutionize healthcare, had significant technical limitations. It couldn't perform most of the tests Theranos claimed it could. When the company began offering blood tests to real patients through partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway, they weren't using the Edison for the majority of tests. They were using traditional lab equipment made by companies like Siemens, the very machines Theranos claimed to be replacing. But the concerning part was how blood samples were being processed to work on these machines, practices that compromised accuracy. And those questionable results were being sent to real patients. People who received information that didn't match their actual health status. People whose medical decisions depended on test results generated by processes that weren't scientifically sound. But how did a company with such fundamental problems convince investors to pour in over $700 million? The answer lies in two people and the toxic culture they created together. Inside Theranos, the culture was one of extreme secrecy and hierarchical control. Employees were required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements that restricted them from speaking about their work, even to other employees in different departments. The company was divided into silo teams, each kept deliberately separate from what the others were doing. Security was extensive. Cameras monitored hallways. Badge readers tracked movement. And at the center of it all were two people, Elizabeth Holmes and a man named Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Balwani was nearly 20 years older than Holmes. He had made millions during the dot-com boom and became Theranos' president and chief operating officer in 2009. But he was also in a romantic relationship with Holmes, a fact they concealed from investors, board members, and employees. Balwani managed the company with strict oversight. He set demanding performance standards. He created an atmosphere where questioning the technology or raising concerns about accuracy was discouraged. And those who persistently raised issues often found their employment terminated. Then a young man with a famous last name walked into the Theranos lab, and what he discovered would set in motion the company's destruction. But speaking up would cost him everything. Tyler Schultz was 22 years old when he joined Theranos in 2013. He had every reason to trust the company. His grandfather, George Schultz, was a former Secretary of State, a towering figure in American politics, and a prominent board member at Theranos. Tyler believed in the mission. He believed in Elizabeth Holmes. But once he started working in the lab, he saw the same troubling patterns that Erica Cheung would later witness. Tests were showing inconsistent results. Data handling raised questions. Quality control protocols seemed inadequate. When Tyler raised his concerns internally, they were dismissed. When he escalated them, he faced professional pushback. Sunny Balwani personally met with him and expressed that his concerns were unfounded. The message was clear: accept the company's position or leave. Tyler resigned, but he couldn't let it go. He knew patients could be affected. He knew the science wasn't supporting the claims. So he did something extraordinarily brave and extraordinarily costly. He reached out to a journalist. And that decision would change everything. His name was John Carreyrou, and he was about to take on one of the most powerful startups in Silicon Valley. What he didn't know was that Theranos would fight back with everything they had. By 2014, a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter named John Carreyrou had begun receiving information about Theranos. Carreyrou was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with a reputation for thorough, careful reporting. And the more he investigated, the more concerned he became. He spoke to former employees who described a culture of opacity. He reviewed internal documents that revealed the Edison was rarely used for actual patient testing. He learned about quality testing challenges, about sample processing issues, about patients receiving potentially inaccurate information. And he kept digging deeper. Every source led to another. Every document raised more questions. And the picture that emerged was shocking. A multi-billion-dollar company built on claims that couldn't be verified. Theranos, meanwhile, was preparing a strong response. When Carreyrou reached out for comment, the company didn't just deny his allegations. They launched an aggressive legal and public relations strategy designed to challenge him and discourage publication. They retained one of the most prominent attorneys in America, David Boies, who sent assertive letters to the Wall Street Journal and to Carreyrou personally. They contacted his editor. They contacted his sources. They attempted to prevent the story from being published. The pressure was immense. But Carreyrou wouldn't back down. And here is what makes the story even more unbelievable. The investors who lost hundreds of millions were naive amateurs. They were some of the smartest, wealthiest, most powerful people on the planet. So how did they all miss it? What's striking about the Theranos situation is not just the scale of the problems. but the sheer number of intelligent, accomplished people who invested in the company. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. The Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, invested $150 million. Betsy DeVos and her family invested $100 million. The total raise was over $700 million. These weren't inexperienced investors. These were some of the wealthiest, most sophisticated investors in the world. So how did this happen? Part of the answer lies in Elizabeth Holmes' approach. She was highly strategic in her communications and relationship building. She surrounded herself with influential board members who had impressive credentials in policy and military affairs, but limited medical or scientific expertise, and whose names lent significant credibility. She cultivated relationships with powerful individuals who saw in her a reflection of entrepreneurial ambition. She positioned herself as a rare female founder in a male-dominated industry, which made some hesitant to question her claims. And according to later evidence, she made statements that weren't supported by the facts. Repeatedly, systematically, effectively. But in October 2015, everything changed. One article was about to bring down a $9 billion empire, and Elizabeth Holmes' response would only make things worse. On October 15, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published Carrero's first investigative article. The headline was direct and impactful. Hot startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology. The article detailed the company's reliance on traditional machines, the accuracy issues with its tests, and the significant gap between what Theranos promised and what it actually delivered. The response from Theranos was immediate and forceful. Elizabeth Holmes appeared on CNBC on Mad Money with Jim Cramer, defending her company with composed confidence. She disputed the article's claims. She said the journal had relied on former employees with grievances. She maintained the technology was valid. She was convincing. She was calm. But the scrutiny was intensifying. More former employees came forward. More articles were published, and the pressure kept mounting. Within months, federal regulators began their own investigations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected Theranos' lab in Newark, California, and found serious deficiencies that pose risks to patient safety. The findings were damning. Walgreens terminated its partnership, walking away from a relationship they had invested years and resources into. Safeway, which had invested over $100 million renovating stores to accommodate Theranos testing centers, ended its agreement. The carefully constructed empire was crumbling. Investors began demanding answers. The prestigious board members started to distance themselves. And then prosecutors uncovered something that would send both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani to prison. The evidence showed that Holmes didn't act alone. Sunny Balwani was her partner in managing operations. He oversaw the day-to-day functions. He maintained the position that the Edison worked, even as evidence suggested otherwise. And when federal prosecutors began their investigation, both Holmes and Balwani presented different narratives about responsibility. Holmes' legal team argued she had been in an emotionally difficult relationship with Balwani and that he had influenced her decisions. Balwani's legal team argued he had relied on Holmes' representations about the scientific validity. But the evidence presented a different picture. Emails, text messages, internal documents. All of it suggested a coordinated pattern of misrepresentation that lasted for years and affected thousands of patients. In March 2018, the hammer fell, and the charges were devastating. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani with significant violations. The sex complaint detailed how they had provided inaccurate information to investors, exaggerated the company's technology and revenues, and made false claims about partnerships and endorsements. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting or denying the allegations, agreeing to relinquish control of the company, pay a $500,000 penalty, and accept a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company. But this was just the beginning. The criminal investigation was continuing, and the charges that were coming would be far more serious. In June 2018, A federal grand jury indicted Holmes and Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged they had engaged in a scheme to provide false information to investors, doctors, and patients. The maximum sentence for each count was 20 years in prison. The stakes couldn't be higher. The trial would take years to begin, delayed by the pandemic, by legal proceedings, and by Holmes's pregnancy and the birth of her first child. But it was coming, and the world would be watching. When the trial finally began in September 2021, the courtroom was packed with journalists from around the world. What they would hear over the next 3 months would be absolutely shocking. When the trial finally began in the fall of 2021, the courtroom was full. Journalists came from around the world. The case had become a cultural touchstone, a symbol of Silicon Valley's challenges, of the risks of unchecked ambition, of the founder worship culture. For 3 months, prosecutors presented extensive evidence. They called former employees who testified about the workplace culture and data handling practices. They described an environment of fear and secrecy. They talked about being pressured to produce results that the technology couldn't deliver. They revealed the extent to which traditional lab equipment was being used instead of the Edison. Then came the investors, and their testimony revealed just how elaborate the deception had been. Prosecutors called investors who described being given inaccurate information about the technology's capabilities. They had been told the Edison could run hundreds of tests. They had been shown demonstrations that were misleading. They had been given revenue projections that were vastly inflated. They had been told about military contracts that didn't exist in the form described. Each investor's testimony added another layer to the picture of systematic misrepresentation. But nothing prepared the courtroom for what came next, the patients. Real people whose lives had been thrown into chaos by false test results. They called patients who received incorrect results, including one woman who was told she had HIV when she didn't. Imagine receiving that diagnosis. Imagine the terror, the stigma, the life decisions you would make based on that information. And it was wrong. Another patient was told she was miscarrying when she wasn't. The emotional trauma of believing you're losing a child based on a test result that was completely inaccurate. These weren't abstract business failures. These were real people, real lives, real harm. And then the whistleblowers took the stand. Tyler Schultz and Erica Cheung would finally tell their story to the world. They called Tyler Schultz and Erica Cheung the whistleblowers who had taken significant personal and professional risks to reveal the truth. Tyler described the culture inside Theranos, the intimidation, the secrecy, the retaliation he faced when he raised concerns. He talked about how his own grandfather, George Schultz, had sided with Elizabeth Holmes over him, how his family had turned against him, how he had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees, how he had been isolated, threatened, and pursued by one of the most aggressive legal teams in America. And yet he had persisted. Erica Cheung described working in the lab, seeing quality control failures, raising concerns, and being shut down. Together, their testimony painted a picture of a company where truth was subordinated to narrative, where patient safety was secondary to fundraising, where loyalty was valued over accuracy. The defense had one strategy: paint Elizabeth Holmes as a victim. But would the jury believe it? The defense presented Holmes as an entrepreneur who genuinely believed in her vision, but whose judgment had been affected by her relationship with Balwani. They brought in expert testimony about relationship dynamics and emotional manipulation. They attempted to present her as someone who made errors in judgment rather than deliberate choices. Holmes herself took the stand, something defendants rarely do in fraud cases. She testified for 7 days. She described her relationship with Balwani as controlling and abusive. She claimed he had monitored her calls, controlled what she ate, told her she was incompetent. She cried on the stand. She appeared vulnerable. But the prosecution had emails, text messages, and documents that told a different story. They showed her making decisions independently. They showed her crafting misleading statements. They showed her awareness of the technology's limitations and her choice to proceed anyway. After 3 months of testimony and 7 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. and it would determine Elizabeth Holmes's fate for the next decade. In January 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on charges related to defrauding patients, a verdict that surprised many legal observers. The jury believed she had deliberately misled investors, but couldn't reach the same conclusion about patient harm. But the guilty verdicts carried serious consequences. In November 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. He noted the seriousness of her actions and the lack of demonstrated remorse. He acknowledged that she was a mother to a young child, but said that couldn't override the severity of the crimes. Sunny Balwani faced his own trial, and his outcome would be even worse. Sunny Balwani was tried separately and convicted on all 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy. The jury rejected his claims that he had been misled by Holmes. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in prison, longer than Holmes' sentence. Both have filed appeals. Both requested to remain free pending appeal, and both requests were denied. In May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes reported to a minimum security federal prison in Bryan, Texas. She is serving her sentence. Her earliest possible release date is December 2032. She will be 48 years old. Balwani is also currently incarcerated. But the story of Theranos is bigger than just Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani. It's a story about all of us. The Theranos situation is more than a story about one person's ambition or one company's failure. It's a case study about Silicon Valley culture, about the appeal of disruption narratives, about the importance of verifying claims with evidence. In the tech world, there's a phrase that's often used: fake it till you make it. It's meant to encourage confidence, to push founders to communicate their vision even before it's fully realized. But Theranos reveals the serious problems with that mentality when taken too far. The evidence showed that Holmes didn't just project confidence beyond what was warranted. According to prosecutors, she misrepresented scientific capabilities. She made claims about results that weren't accurate. She described partnerships in ways that weren't truthful. And when the misrepresentations could no longer be maintained, real people were affected. Patients received inaccurate diagnoses. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Employees had their careers disrupted and their professional reputations questioned. And trust in innovation, in entrepreneurship, in the promise of technology to improve lives was damaged. This is the real cost of corporate fraud. It's not just financial. It's human. It's the erosion of trust in institutions, in innovation, in the possibility of genuine breakthroughs. What makes Elizabeth Holmes different from other fraudsters? Why are we still talking about her years later? What makes Elizabeth Holmes' case so significant and so studied is not just what happened, but how it happened. She didn't fit typical patterns. She wasn't careless or obviously reckless. She was disciplined, controlled, methodical. She cultivated an image of seriousness and mission-driven purpose. She communicated in the language of idealism and social good. She made people want to believe in her. And that's what makes her story so instructive. Problematic business practices don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. Sometimes they come wrapped in charisma and conviction. Sometimes they look like breakthrough innovation until examined closely. And by the time thorough examination happens, consequences have already occurred. The psychology of Elizabeth Holmes remains a subject of intense fascination and debate. How does someone go from being an idealistic Stanford student to a convicted fraudster? Was there a moment when she knew the technology didn't work and chose to continue anyway? Or did she maintain a form of self-deception, convincing herself that if she could just raise enough money, hire enough scientists, and buy enough time, she could eventually make the Edison function as promised? The evidence presented at trial suggested that she was aware of the technology S limitations relatively early in the company S history. Internal emails and messages showed her receiving reports about failed tests, patient complaints, and regulatory concerns. And yet she continued to make public statements that contradicted these private realities. Tyler Schultz and Erica Chiang paid an enormous price for telling the truth. And what happened to them should concern every single one of us. Tyler Schultz paid a significant price for coming forward with his concerns. His family relationships became strained. His grandfather, George Schultz, initially sided with Elizabeth Holmes and didn't believe Tyler's allegations, even as evidence accumulated. Tyler spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees defending himself against Theranos' legal challenges. He experienced damaged relationships. He experienced years of stress and uncertainty. But he never stopped believing that what he was doing was right. Eventually, George Schultz reconciled with his grandson before his passing in 2021. He finally acknowledged that Tyler had been correct all along. It was a painful, delayed vindication. But it came. Erica Chiang, too, faced professional and legal challenges. But like Tyler, she remained committed to the truth. Together, they helped expose a billion-dollar scandal. And they did it not because it was easy or financially rewarding, but because they believed it was necessary. The courage of these whistleblowers cannot be overstated. They were young professionals at the beginning of their careers, facing one of the most well-funded and legally aggressive companies in Silicon Valley. They were confronted with non-disclosure agreements, legal threats, and the prospect of being blacklisted in their industry. Tyler's own family initially turned against him. The emotional toll was immense. The financial burden was crushing, and yet they persisted. So what does Theranos teach us? And more importantly, is it happening again right now? The legacy of Theranos continues to unfold. It has inspired books, documentaries, podcasts, and important discussions about how society evaluates innovation and decides whom to trust. It has led to calls for greater scrutiny of private companies making significant scientific claims. It has encouraged investors to ask more thorough questions and demand more rigorous evidence. But have the lessons really been learned? In Silicon Valley today, there are dozens of startups making extraordinary claims. Some will deliver genuine breakthroughs, but some won't. And the question is, how do we tell the difference before patients are harmed and billions are lost? The investors who lost money in Theranos also deserve examination. These were not unsophisticated individuals. They included some of the wealthiest families in America, successful media executives, and prominent venture capitalists. How did they all miss the warning signs? Part of the answer is that they relied on reputation and relationships rather than rigorous due diligence. Many invested because other prominent people had invested. They were impressed by the board of directors. They were persuaded by Holmes' presentation skills. And critically, they didn't insist on seeing the underlying scientific data or having independent experts evaluate the technology. The regulatory failures are perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story because they reveal how easily the system can be exploited. For years, the company operated with minimal oversight, even as it was providing medical test results that affected patient care decisions. The FDA has limited resources and must prioritize its oversight activities. But the Theranos case revealed gaps in how laboratory-developed tests are regulated. Theranos exploited this regulatory gap, scaling its testing services to thousands of patients while avoiding the rigorous clinical validation that would have revealed the technology's limitations. The case has prompted calls for regulatory reform, for clearer standards about when companies must seek FDA approval, and for better mechanisms to ensure that patients aren't harmed by inadequately validated medical technologies. But reform is slow. And in the meantime, how many other companies are operating in similar gray areas? The media made Elizabeth Holmes. And that's a truth we need to confront. The media also played a complicated role in this story. In the early years, Elizabeth Holmes was celebrated uncritically in numerous profiles and cover stories. She was presented as a visionary, a role model, a disruptor who would change healthcare. Very few journalists asked hard questions about the technology or insisted on seeing independent validation. This created a positive feedback loop where the media coverage enhanced the company's credibility, which made it easier to raise money and form partnerships, which generated more positive media coverage. It wasn't until John Carreyrou at the Wall Street Journal began his investigation that the narrative shifted. His reporting was meticulous, carefully sourced, and legally defensible. The Theranos case is a reminder of the essential role that investigative journalism plays in holding powerful institutions accountable. As Elizabeth Holmes serves her sentence, society continues to process what her case represents. Some view her as a cautionary example about the risks of Silicon Valley's competitive culture. Others see her case as raising questions about how ambitious founders are perceived and judged differently based on various factors. Still, others see her simply as someone who committed serious crimes and is facing appropriate consequences. Perhaps the reality contains elements of multiple perspectives. What's clear is that Elizabeth Holmes created something powerful. Not a medical breakthrough, but a compelling narrative. And that narrative was so well crafted, so perfectly aligned with the ambitions and hopes of its time, that it convinced many people, until the evidence became overwhelming. So here's the question that should keep us all awake at night. In the end, Theranos promised a single drop of blood could reveal everything. But what it actually demonstrated was something more sobering, that even sophisticated systems of oversight can be circumvented, that the consequences of corporate misrepresentation extend far beyond financial losses, and that protecting patients and investors requires constant vigilance. Some promises sound revolutionary, and when they do, they deserve thorough verification. The question is, have we learned the lessons from this case? Will future oversight be more effective? Will investors demand better evidence? Will journalists ask harder questions? Will regulators close the gaps that allowed Theranos to operate for so long? Because ambitious entrepreneurs will always emerge with transformative visions. Some of those visions will be genuine breakthroughs that improve millions of lives. But some will be illusions built on misrepresentation and maintained through intimidation. And society must be prepared to support genuine innovation while maintaining the scrutiny necessary to protect the public interest. The story of Theranos is not just about Elizabeth Holmes. It's about all of us, about the systems we've created, about the incentives we've established, and about the values we choose to prioritize. It's about whether we value truth over narrative, evidence over charisma, and patient safety over market valuations. These aren't easy choices. They require courage, persistence, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. But they're essential, because the next Theranos is already forming somewhere. The next compelling founder is already crafting their pitch. And whether we catch them early or discover the truth only after the damage is done will depend on whether we've learned the lessons that Elizabeth Holmes, Tyler Schultz, Erica Keung, and everyone touched by Theranos have taught us. The blood promise was broken, but the promise we make to each other, to demand truth and protect the vulnerable, that promise must hold. That's the real test. And it's one we face every day.